James Potter was born into comfort, but not into complacency. He grew up in Godric's Hollow, a place whose cobbled lanes held the faded footprints of legends. His parents, Euphemia and Fleamont, were older than most, doting, wise, and unmistakably proud of their only son. They had waited long for a child, and when he finally came, he was loved with the kind of fullness that leaves little room for doubt. James never questioned his worth. He was the kind of boy who filled a room without meaning to, whose laughter always seemed just around the corner, and who never had to wonder if he was wanted. From early childhood, he was spirited, irreverent, and dazzlingly confident. He climbed everything, broke nearly as much, and found trouble like a niffler finds gold. But it was never cruel trouble, just the kind that left neighbors shaking their heads and smiling in the same breath. He had a broomstick before he could write his name, and by 7, he was zipping around the orchard behind his home with enough recklessness to give his mother heart palpitations. What James learned early was that he was special not because someone told him so, but because the world never made him feel otherwise. This belief would become both his charm and his flaw. Beneath the confidence, though, was something gentler. His father, Fleamont, a quiet man with clever hands and kind eyes, taught James to respect all magic, not just the kind that won duels. And Euphemia, sharp and warm in equal measure, made sure her son knew that strength meant little if it didn't include compassion. But those lessons would take time to bloom. At 11, James mostly cared about broomsticks, exploding snap, and the idea of becoming someone unforgettable. He stepped onto the Hogwarts Express for the first time not as a boy looking for a new world, but as a boy ready to conquer one. Sirius Black was born into a family that mistook blood for love and tradition for truth. His home at 12 Grimmauld Place was dark not only in stone and shadow, but in belief. The Blacks prided themselves on being one of the noble and most ancient wizarding families, a phrase spoken often in Sirius's presence, usually while condemning someone who had married a muggle or befriended the wrong kind of wizard. To be born a Black was to be taught that the world owed you reverence. But even as a child, Sirius did not accept the script handed to him. He questioned, he mocked, he laughed when he was meant to sneer. There was a wildness in him that his mother tried to burn out with words and portraits and curses muttered under her breath. His father responded with silence, a disappointment that settled like dust in every room Sirius entered. He had a younger brother, Regulus, more dutiful and less defiant. But even Regulus sometimes looked at Sirius with the quiet awe one reserves for someone who lives as if they're unafraid of consequences. Sirius was everything a Black was not meant to be: disobedient, irreverent, loud with his laughter, and unashamed of his scorn. Magic came easily to him, but approval never did. By the time his Hogwarts letter arrived, Sirius saw it not as an invitation, but an escape hatch. He boarded the train with sharp eyes and a quiet hunger, not for power, but for distance. He did not yet know that salvation would come in the form of 3 boys he hadn't met, and a common room he was never meant to belong to. But something in him was already turning a flame that had been smothered for years was waiting to catch the first breath of free air. Remus Lupin's story did not begin in peace, nor in privilege, but in the long shadow cast by a curse. He was bitten by Fenrir Greyback at the age of 5. A werewolf's bite is not just a wound, it is a sentence, a transformation that rewrites the body and the life that follows. Remus had been a quiet, thoughtful child even before that night. Afterward, he became something else, cautious, observant, and far older than his years allowed. His parents, Lyle and Hope Lupin, tried their best. They hid the truth, then tried to explain it, then tried to make it disappear. They moved often, pulling Remus out of schools when questions started circling. The full moon was not just a date on the calendar, it was a threat that loomed every month, reminding Remus that he was not like other boys. He learned early to hide his pain, to hold his tongue, to smile when necessary and disappear when possible. But beneath the quiet exterior was a mind that burned with curiosity. Remus read everything he could find: mythology, spell books, ancient history, perhaps believing that if he could understand the world, he could better survive in it. When the letter from Hogwarts came, his parents hesitated. But Albus Dumbledore, in his characteristic defiance of conventional wisdom, made a quiet offer. Arrangements would be made, safety ensured. Remus would be allowed to come. He boarded the train with a worn suitcase and a heart full of doubt. He did not know whether he belonged anywhere, let alone at a school filled with children who had never howled in pain, who had never looked at their own reflection and feared it. But he went anyway, and that courage, soft and unseen, would come to define him. Peter Pettigrew grew up in the sort of house where magic lived in the wallpaper, but not in conversation. His parents were mild-mannered, working-class witches and wizards, the kind who never sought attention, who valued safety over ambition. From the beginning, Peter was smaller than his peers, always a bit behind, not stupid, just uncertain. He wasn't the kind of boy you noticed in a crowd, but he noticed everyone else. He watched. That was his gift, if you could call it that. Peter saw things others didn't. He saw the way children flocked to those who sparkled with confidence. He noticed who was feared, who was admired, who was overlooked. He was not unaware of how the world worked. He simply didn't know how to work within it. His magic was slow to develop, but it came, like a flower blooming late but stubborn. When his letter from Hogwarts arrived, his parents cried not because they were surprised, but because they were relieved. Peter entered the magical world already prepared to follow. He didn't want to be famous, didn't crave a spotlight. What he wanted was to belong, to matter to someone who mattered. That longing would shape the rest of his life. On the train to Hogwarts, he kept to the shadows, but fate, ever strange, was already aligning him with boys who would soon burn bright enough to eclipse everything else. They were 4 very different boys when they met. One was golden and loud and endlessly certain. One was bitter and brilliant, drawn to rebellion like a moth to flame. One was quiet and scarred, holding secrets in his chest like stones. One was eager and uncertain, hoping someone else's light might spill over onto him. When they sat in the same dormitory under the red and gold banners of Gryffindor Tower, none of them knew what they would become. They were not yet Marauders, not yet legends, not yet betrayers or heroes or martyrs. They were just 4 boys at the beginning of something none of them could name. And the castle, ever ancient, watched them settle in, its halls echoing with the steps of children who would soon carve their names into its story, whether it wanted them to or not. The train ride to Hogwarts was the beginning of something that none of them could fully understand. The compartments were filled with children chattering with nervous energy, dragging owls in cages and trunks that scraped the doors. James Potter had already taken to it all like he belonged there, feet up on the seat, wand tucked behind one ear, cracking jokes that made other first-years laugh, even if they didn't quite understand the punchline. Sirius Black sat beside him, outwardly disinterested, arms crossed and eyes half-lidded, but listening to every word. He had long ago perfected the art of looking like he didn't care. Remus Lupin sat diagonally across from them, careful with his posture, as if not to take up too much space, a book resting open in his lap, though he hadn't turned the page in over 20 minutes. And Peter Pettigrew, awkward and wide-eyed, lingered near the door, unsure whether he belonged in the carriage at all, waiting for someone to tell him to leave. The four of them were not yet friends. Not really. They were children thrown together by chance and alphabetical proximity. But even on that first ride, there was something forming, something unsaid. James had already started to pull Peter into the edges of conversation, tossing him a chocolate frog and pretending not to notice how nervously he fumbled with the wrapper. Sirius had insulted James twice, both times with a sharpness meant to test how easily the other boy bruised. When James didn't react, only grinned wider, Sirius had allowed himself the smallest smirk. Remus watched it all quietly, cautious. He had already done the calculations, how much to say, how much to hold back, who to avoid. The scars on his body were reminders of what people could become when they knew too much. As the sky darkened outside the window and the train curved through the hills, lanterns flickered on in the corridors. Prefects walked up and down, reminding students to put on their robes. Outside, the vast lake shimmered with the first brush of moonlight. When the train finally stopped, the air was cold and smelled of pine. Hagrid's voice boomed over the noise, calling for first-years to follow him. They stumbled down to the boats, 4 to each, and the lake carried them forward. Hogwarts rose before them like something summoned out of legend, its windows glowing against the mountains, its turrets brushing the stars. For some, it was awe. For others, it was salvation. Sirius looked up at it with something like defiance, as though daring the castle to change him. Peter clutched the edges of the boat and stared upward in silence. Remus exhaled slowly, the cold mist curling from his lips. James grinned at it all, already imagining the Quidditch pitch. Inside the castle, they were shepherded into a chamber off the great hall, the doors looming ahead like the mouth of something ancient and waiting. There were whispers about what the sorting would be, about spells and tests and creatures that judged you. Remus already knew what house he hoped for, but dared not say. Peter wanted to be anywhere but Slytherin, though he would have taken even that if it meant not going home a failure. Sirius said nothing. He hadn't spoken since they left the boats. James stood with his hands in his pockets, rocking back on his heels, trying to look casual. The Sorting Hat waited on a stool like a relic from a long-forgotten tale, patched and silent, until it was placed on a head. Then it came to life, loud and unbothered by the centuries it had weathered. One by one, names were called. Some were sorted quickly, others required more time, the hat mumbling to itself, debating the intricacies of loyalty and ambition and potential. When Potter James was called, he strode forward like he was being crowned. The hat barely touched his hair before shouting, "Gryffindor!" And James spun off the stool with a grin that could have lit the whole hall. When Black Sirius followed soon after, the silence was heavier. Everyone knew that name. The hat paused on Sirius's head, longer than it had for James, muttering about power and legacy, about the sharp mind it found and the pride wrapped tightly around it. But in the end, it too cried, "Gryffindor," and the shock rippled through the room like a spell. Sirius peeled the hat off without ceremony, walking to the table with his jaw set. He didn't look at the Slytherin table, but he could feel the cold gaze of his cousins burning into his back. Remus's name earned no whispers, no surprise. He walked quietly, sat down, and the Sorting Hat sighed in recognition. "Clever and cautious," it murmured, "brave in ways no one sees, You've had to hide yourself, haven't you? Gryffindor, then let them see who you are." He didn't smile when he joined the table, but his shoulders relaxed just a little. Peter followed last of the four, and for a long moment the hat said nothing. Then it spoke softly, weighing his longing against his fear. "You want to prove yourself," it said, "but you're afraid of what that will cost. You don't think you're strong, but you could be." Then, gently, "Gryffindor." And Peter's face lit up with a kind of relief that almost hurt to see. They were sorted. They were Gryffindors. The meal that followed was a blur of golden platters and laughing portraits, of pumpkin juice and warm treacle tart and enchanted ceilings. James talked too much. Sirius ate like he'd never tasted real food. Remus watched everyone carefully, and Peter tried not to drop his fork. That night in the common room, the fire cast long shadows on the stone walls, and their dormitory felt like something stitched out of a fairy tale. 5 beds, red hangings, old trunks, and soft pillows. They didn't speak much as they changed and climbed into bed. There were too many thoughts, too many unknowns. Somewhere above them, the castle groaned gently in its sleep. In the days that followed, something began to settle between them. They didn't become best friends overnight, but proximity has a way of softening walls, and shared classes, shared meals, and shared grumbles about homework created the first small stitches in the seams of friendship. James was quick to charm the professors he liked, and quicker still to antagonize the ones he didn't. Sirius rolled his eyes but followed along anyway. Remus, ever reluctant, tried to stay out of it, but found himself pulled into their orbit more often than not. Peter, still shy, laughed when James did, and followed Sirius's lead in most things, though he always looked to Remus when he was unsure. They discovered things together, that the staircases liked to change direction when you were late, that Peeves had a particular fondness for first years, that Filch's cat, Mrs. Norris, was far too clever for an ordinary feline, that the library had corners so quiet you could hear your own breath echoing off the pages. They got lost, got caught, got sent back to their dormitories more than once. James found that teachers respected cleverness but not cheek, and Sirius learned that even here, even outside his home, the black name carried weight, though not always the kind he wanted. Remus tried to stay unnoticed, but his intelligence betrayed him. Professors praised his essays. He downplayed it every time. Peter listened more than he spoke, but his eyes missed nothing. It was during one of their first defense against the dark arts lessons that something shifted. The professor had asked them to demonstrate a basic shielding charm. James was first to volunteer, wand in hand, before the question was finished. He performed it with flair, the translucent shimmer of the shield flaring to life around him. The class clapped. Sirius went next, less performative but equally effective. When it was Remus's turn, he hesitated just a second too long. The professor raised an eyebrow. Remus stepped forward, cast the charm, and it held, though less brightly. There were murmurs. Peter went last, hands trembling, and failed twice before the professor waved him back to his seat. He looked down at the desk, the rest of the lesson. But afterward, James clapped him on the back and said, "You'll get it next time," like it was obvious. Sirius nodded. Better than that Ravenclaw kid who dropped his wand and nearly hexed himself. It wasn't pity. It wasn't mockery. It was something like inclusion. And for Peter, that was everything. They weren't yet Marauders, but the roots were there. James and Sirius started sitting together in every class, trading quips and trying to outdo each other with charm and recklessness. Remus rolled his eyes but smiled despite himself. Peter lingered close, growing a little bolder each day. They began to move as a group, not always, not yet, but often enough that other students started noticing. The professors began to associate their names, sometimes with praise, sometimes with warnings. By the time the first snow fell over the castle grounds, they had fallen into something that resembled brotherhood, even if they didn't know to call it that yet. What none of them spoke about not then was the feeling of belonging, rare and quietly sacred. James had always known he would be accepted, but Hogwarts gave him a stage on which to shine. Sirius, despite his cynicism, found something close to freedom. Remus, used to hiding, realized he wasn't being watched for the wrong reasons, and Peter, small and overlooked, felt maybe for the first time seen. It was early still. The map hadn't been drawn. The full moons hadn't been shared. The betrayals and battles and heartbreaks were far off, sleeping quietly in a future none of them could yet imagine. For now, they were only boys, loud, uncertain, brilliant, flawed, sitting by the fire in the Gryffindor common room, laughing about nothing, passing notes in charms class, sneaking toast from the kitchens, sharing secrets that would later become scars. But for now, there was only the start of something, a spark, not yet a fire. 4 boys beneath the high stone arches of an ancient castle, beginning the first chapter of a story that would one day be carved into memory. By their second year, they were no longer strangers. The boys who had arrived in wide-eyed uncertainty now walked the corridors of Hogwarts with a familiarity that bordered on ownership. James Potter and Sirius Black, in particular, had become nearly inseparable, 2 points of gravity orbiting each other with chaotic momentum. If there was a laugh echoing down the corridor, it was often one of theirs. If something exploded in potions class, chances were good that the two were at the heart of it. Wand smoke curling around their heads, and expressions of absolute innocence plastered on their faces. What had begun as companionship was growing into something sharper, louder, and more deliberate. They didn't just want to survive school, they wanted to leave their mark on it, and perhaps tear down a few of its rules in the process. Remus Lupin, ever cautious, had at first tried to stay outside the orbit of their mischief. He spent more time in the library than the others, and preferred quiet observation to confrontation. But resistance has a way of softening when it is met with relentless warmth, and James, in particular, seemed determined to pull Remus into their plans. There was something about James's certainty, his way of declaring with absolute conviction that a prank would work, that they wouldn't get caught, that no one would get hurt, that made even Remus set down his book and follow. Sirius, too, seemed to soften in Remus's presence, as though aware that this quiet boy who flinched at sudden sounds might hold a kind of strength that couldn't be measured in spells or charm. Peter Pettigrew followed wherever they led. He was smaller, rounder, and never the first to speak, but he laughed when they laughed and defended them in the rare instances anyone dared to criticize. What he lacked in magical skill, he made up for in loyalty and eagerness to be useful, to be necessary. James once joked that Peter was like a shadow that talked back. Peter had smiled at that, not realizing until later that shadows can also disappear. Together they began to make names for themselves not just as students, but as something closer to a legend in progress. It began with small things, slipping dung bombs into Slytherin robes, charming the suits of armor to sing off-key love ballads during breakfast, sneaking into the kitchens to smuggle chocolate eclairs back to the common room. But their creativity grew quickly. They mapped out secret passages using guesswork, memory, and a surprising knack for deduction. Sirius discovered one behind a tapestry on the fourth floor after he crashed into it during a game of corridor tag. Remus, with his keen sense of patterns, noticed the passage shifted slightly on Tuesdays. James began sketching it all into a notebook he hid in the bottom of his trunk. Peter made sure no one ever saw them go in, or if they did, they didn't remember. Their growing confidence fed off itself. They weren't just pulling pranks, they were building a shared language, a mythology with themselves at the center. James began referring to them as the Four. Sirius preferred the Brotherhood. Remus only rolled his eyes, but they were no longer just boys at school. They were becoming a unit, a collective force. It was not yet the Marauders in name, but it was something close. Yet, even in their laughter, there were shadows. Remus's absences were becoming harder to explain. Every few weeks, he would vanish, sometimes for days. There was always a reason, a sick relative, a fever, a family obligation. But the lies wore thin, and the others began to wonder. James noticed the way Remus flinched at certain smells. Sirius observed the pattern in the absences. Peter, always watching, simply knew something wasn't right. It came to a head one winter afternoon in third year. The snow had fallen heavy, and the grounds were wrapped in white silence. The common room was filled with the crackle of firewood and the scent of hot chocolate. Remus had returned from another mysterious absence, pale and tired, a thin scar visible along the side of his neck. Sirius said nothing at first, only stared for a long time. Later, in the dormitory, after the others had gone to bed, Sirius leaned over the side of his bed and whispered, "You're not sick. You're cursed, aren't you?" Remus said nothing. Sirius waited. "You're a werewolf," he said finally, voice low, without malice. Remus closed his eyes. There was silence between them for a long time. Then Sirius climbed down from his bed, crossed the room, and sat on Remus's. "You think we wouldn't still want you around?" he asked. "You think that changes anything?" James heard them talking and joined. Peter stirred, confused, but eventually understood. No one shouted. No one left the room. James only nodded slowly and said, "It makes sense now." Peter asked if it hurt. Remus lied and said it didn't. That moment, quiet, unremarkable in the grand sweep of their days, was the foundation on which the Marauders were truly built. Trust, spoken without ceremony. Acceptance, given without demand. They didn't pity Remus. They didn't treat him as something broken. They asked questions. They made jokes. They made plans. The next morning, Sirius sat down beside James at breakfast and said, "We could become animagi." James blinked. "What?" You heard me. If we're animagi, we can be with him. During the full moon, he wouldn't be alone." James stared at him for a long moment, and then something flickered in his eyes, a wild, impossible spark. "You're insane." Sirius grinned. "You're saying no?" James grinned back. Remus tried to talk them out of it. Of course, he told them it was dangerous, illegal, ridiculous. They listened and agreed, and then ignored him entirely. Peter, desperate not to be left behind, vowed he would do whatever it took, even if it killed him. James began sneaking books from the restricted section. Sirius charmed his quill to take notes without looking. Peter practiced simple transformations late into the night. It was difficult. It was frustrating. But it was theirs. A secret mission that bound them tighter than ever. Even Remus, though he never participated, watched with something like awe. No one had ever done something like that for him. No one had ever tried. Outside their circle, the rest of Hogwarts began to notice. The pranks had grown more elaborate, the charm work more advanced. A Slytherin's hair turned into snakes during transfiguration. A batch of cupcakes in the Great Hall exploded into fireworks. Filch found all his keys replaced with decoys that screamed when touched. The Marauders were becoming a whispered name, still unspoken aloud, but etched in the collective memory of their classmates. Teachers began to frown when they saw James and Sirius together. Remus was harder to pin blame on, too polite, too quiet. Peter was too nervous to accuse. But James and Sirius were unmistakable, loud with laughter, and always just one step ahead of trouble. McGonagall once told them they were brilliant, infuriating, and exhausting, all in the same sentence. James beamed at the compliment. Sirius only bowed dramatically and promised to try harder. By the end of third year, they had built more than a friendship. They had built a mythology, even if it hadn't yet found its name. James, Sirius, Remus, and Peter. 4 boys bound by magic and mischief, by secrets and promises, and the wild certainty of youth. The world beyond Hogwarts still seemed far away. The war that brewed in dark corners hadn't yet touched them. They were not yet soldiers. They were not yet betrayed. For now they were only boys, brilliant, reckless, and untouchable. And though they did not yet understand it, those years, those long, golden years of laughter and firelight would be the ones they would carry with them long after everything else had fallen away. They had known for a while, not all the details, and not with certainty, but the shape of it had begun to form. The absences were too regular, too perfectly timed with the lunar cycle. The pale skin, the new scars, the way Remus sometimes flinched from touch or winced when he sat down too hard after returning from one of his disappearances, none of it escaped notice. They were clever boys, cleverer than most gave them credit for, and when clever boys care deeply enough, they begin to ask questions no one else dares to ask. Sirius was the first to say the word aloud, though he didn't say it like a weapon. He said it the way one speaks a difficult truth, one already known in the marrow. Werewolf. Remus hadn't expected them to figure it out so soon, or perhaps he had been hoping they never would. Dumbledore had made arrangements, of course had gone to great lengths to ensure Remus could attend Hogwarts in secrecy, transporting him to the shrieking shack under the cover of the Whomping Willow, a violent guardian no student dared approach. Potions and protections had been placed. The staff had agreed to silence, but none of those plans accounted for the 3 boys who shared Remus's dormitory, who noticed when his bed lay cold and untouched once a month, and who saw the pain he tried so hard to tuck beneath his calm demeanor. When they confronted him, it was not dramatic. They didn't ambush him or shout or demand explanations. It was winter, and the wind outside howled through the cracks in the castle walls like something alive. Remus had just returned, gaunt and quiet, and James had left a chocolate bar on his pillow without a word. Later that night, Sirius sat on the end of his bed and asked, not unkindly, "How long have you been hiding it?" Remus didn't lie. He only looked away. James leaned against the bedpost, arms folded, watching. Peter hovered by the desk, chewing his thumbnail. The silence was heavy, but not cruel. "Since I was 5, Remus said finally, and his voice was a shadow. "Greyback." He didn't elaborate. They didn't ask him to. What followed was not fear, not disgust, not retreat. What followed was something unspoken but monumental. They stayed. They didn't treat him like glass or threat or pity. They simply stayed, as if the revelation had not fractured anything but instead welded their strange constellation of loyalty into something stronger. It was Sirius who first said, "We want to help." It was James who said, "We've already started." It was Peter who said, "Even if it's dangerous." And it was Remus, shaken and silent, who could not find the words to respond. He had grown up with fear in his blood and shame in his lungs. He had expected rejection, had always braced for it, but what they gave him instead was a plan. A wild, stupid, beautiful plan. They would become animagi. It wasn't just an idea. It became a mission. They stole books from the restricted section, hiding them beneath loose floorboards in their dormitory. They practiced in abandoned classrooms, whispered spells over half-melted candles, and compared notes in the backs of notebooks disguised as astronomy assignments. It was slow, grueling work. Becoming an animagus was not a charm you could master in a weekend or even a term. It took months to prepare, years to complete, and the slightest misstep could result in transformation that was not only permanent but grotesquely wrong. But they persisted. James, ever the natural, was the quickest to grasp the theory. Sirius had the raw power, fierce and instinctive. Peter, surprisingly, was the most patient. He copied every instruction 3 times, checked and rechecked his work. He wanted this more than any of them, not because of Remus, not entirely, but because it meant belonging, permanence, a place that could never be taken from him. And Remus, though he didn't help directly, couldn't help watching them with a quiet ache that twisted somewhere deep inside. No one had ever done something like this for him, not even his own parents. They had loved him, yes, but with the kind of love that hovered on the edge of worry, the kind that built cages instead of bridges. There were setbacks. One of their early test potions exploded and singed off Sirius's eyebrows for 2 weeks. James once lost the ability to speak English for a full day, stuck instead repeating a strange series of barks and whistles. Peter accidentally turned half of his left hand translucent and had to wear gloves until it faded, but none of it stopped them. If anything, their failures became badges of honor, signs that they were still in it together. The more they failed, the more determined they became. Outside their private world, Hogwarts spun on as it always had. Classes passed, seasons changed, Quidditch matches were won and lost, and teachers continued to sigh at the growing mischief left in their wake. They were known now, not just as pranksters, but as something else, something wilder. There was a charm to them, yes, especially James and Sirius, who walked the halls with an effortless confidence that turned heads and set standards. But there was also an intensity, a closeness that excluded others without meaning to, a sense that they were building something too complicated for the rest of the world to understand. Remus still kept his distance. In some ways, he was friendly, warm even, but always careful. He still flinched at praise, still struggled to look anyone in the eye when they asked too many questions. But with James, Sirius, and Peter, something softened. He laughed more. He allowed himself to be pulled into their schemes, even if only on the edges. He still tried to warn them, still told them they were mad, but his smile betrayed him. He wanted to believe they could do it, and slowly, impossibly, they began to succeed. The first real breakthrough came when James managed to identify the animal form latent within his magical core, a stag. It fit him somehow noble, proud, a creature made for running fast and leading the charge. Sirius followed not long after, discovering the dog within him, massive and black-furred, strong and loyal and reckless. Peter's form, a rat, came last. At first, he was embarrassed by it, how small, How unimpressive. But James clapped him on the back and said, "You're the one who can get through places none of us can." "That's brilliant." And Sirius added, "Perfect for sneaking into kitchens." Even Remus had smiled, and that, more than anything, had made Peter stand a little taller. They didn't attempt the transformations at first. Too dangerous. They spent weeks building resistance, training their bodies, preparing their minds. Animagus magic was ancient and wild, and the risk of becoming trapped between forms was very real. But slowly, piece by piece, they each learned to let go, to shift, to return. It was a terrifying and exhilarating thing to become something else, to surrender control and then take it back. When they finally began to master it, they did so in secret. No one else knew, not even the professors. Their first night with Remus came in early spring. The sky was clear, the moon full and bright. Remus had withdrawn, as he always did, preparing himself for the painful solitude he had grown used to. But this time, as he passed through the hidden tunnel beneath the whomping willow, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, and there they were, 3 animals where 3 boys should have been. A stag, tall and graceful. A black dog, fierce and gleaming. A rat, small and quick. They didn't speak, didn't need to. They followed him, not as boys, but as creatures bound by something deeper than words. That night, for the first time in years, Remus was not alone in his transformation. He howled, yes, but it was not a howl of grief. He ran, and they ran with him. He raged, and they kept their distance, circling protectively. In the morning, when he awoke on the floor of the shrieking shack, sore and shivering but alive, he found a blanket draped over his shoulders and a chocolate bar left beside his hand. He wept quietly then, not because he was sad, but because no one had ever stayed. After that, it became ritual. Every full moon, they transformed. They explored the grounds, kept Remus safe, learned the rhythms of his rage and the limits of his restraint. They even gave themselves names, childish at first, but names that would come to mean something more. James was Prongs, Sirius was Padfoot, Peter was Wormtail, and Remus, by unanimous vote, was Moony. They etched those names into the corners of their notebooks, into the bark of a tree near the lake, into each other's memory. They were no longer just friends. They were brothers in the oldest, truest sense, not born of blood, but of choice, of shared danger, of belief that some things loyalty, laughter, love are worth the risk. They didn't know what was coming. Not yet. The war still lived on the edges of the horizon, a shadow just beyond their reach. But in those years, those long, glorious years of firelight and moonlight and whispered plans beneath the covers, they built something stronger than fear. They built the Marauders. By the time they reached their 5th year, there was something untouchable about them, not in the way of heroes or prodigies, but in the way of a secret that's grown too large to be undone. They had done the impossible, not for fame or praise, but for one another. In secret, they had taken the ancient, dangerous art of animagus transformation and made it their own. No registry, no teacher, just stubbornness, genius, and loyalty sharpened against years of hidden work. They were no longer simply 4 boys who shared a dormitory. They had become something more than that, an unspoken pact, sealed in full moons and forests, and the knowledge that none of them would ever again be truly alone. It changed everything. When the transformations were new, they were awkward, exhausting, and tinged with danger. But with time came control. Practice turned fear into instinct, and instinct into freedom. James moved with ease in his stag form, a creature of grace and quiet power. He could leap over felled trees in the forbidden forest without a sound, his antlers catching the starlight as he ran. Sirius, as a dog, was loud and fast, crashing through underbrush, always leading the chase, always first into the clearing. Peter, the rat, darted through tunnels and narrow spaces, impossible to catch, impossible to corner. And Remus, in his wolfish state, was still the most dangerous, but less so, now that he was not alone. Their presence softened him, gave shape to the chaos that the full moon tried to drag from his bones. The wolf remembered them, trusted them, fought less. It wasn't just about protection anymore. It became ritual, tradition, something they looked forward to with a kind of reverence. On the days leading up to the full moon, they would prepare together, collecting supplies, reinforcing the shrieking shack, rehearsing the plan. The transformations became less about survival and more about companionship. They roamed the grounds, under stars, under snow, under summer haze. The world at night was a different place, older, quieter, closer to the raw magic that pulsed beneath the stones of the castle. They knew those woods better than anyone. They knew which trees whispered, which paths shifted, which animals watched them without fear. The forest, for all its danger, became theirs. Their bond deepened in ways words couldn't capture. Sirius began to smile more in unguarded moments, without irony. James, who had always led with boldness, started to listen more. Peter, often unsure of himself, stood taller when he was with them, as if their belief in him had begun to take root inside his chest. And Remus, who had once lived on the edge of their laughter, now stood firmly in its center, no longer afraid of his place. They told no one, not even the professors who suspected too much, not even Dumbledore, who, if he had guessed the truth, said nothing. What they had was sacred, and what they did was illegal, yes, but it was theirs, and they weren't giving it away. But secrecy was never enough for them. They wanted permanence. They wanted to leave a mark that would last beyond their years. That desire, the urge to etch themselves into the bones of Hogwarts, led to their next creation, the Marauders map. It began as an idea, thrown out casually one evening in the common room, long after curfew. Sirius had been sketching on the corner of a textbook, muttering about how inefficient the school's patrol system was. James had taken one look and said, "We could do better." And they did. They learned the castle like smugglers learn tide charts, every shifting corridor, every hidden stairwell, every forgotten tunnel that twisted beneath the dungeons. Peter, in rat form, explored where no one else could go. Sirius and James charmed doorways and locks into revealing their secrets. Remus, with his encyclopedic knowledge of spellcraft, devised a charm system that layered enchantments over ink, over parchment, over memory. It took nearly a year to build. They worked on it at night, by wan light, huddled in corners of the library, whispering over stolen scrolls and half-translated incantations. They fought about it. Remus wanted to be cautious. Peter got frustrated with the complexity. Sirius pushed for more features, and James insisted on making it clever. But when it was finished, it was like holding the castle's soul in their hands. A single piece of parchment, blank to the unknowing, that revealed every hallway, every secret, every person inside Hogwarts in real time. They gave it their nicknames: Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs, and with a flourish of invention and irreverence, they signed it as the proud mischief makers they were. The first time they used it during a prank, it was almost too easy. They slipped past Filch and Mrs. Norris without effort, evaded the patrolling prefects, and left a trail of dancing pumpkins from the Great Hall to the Astronomy Tower. McGonagall was furious. Dumbledore pretended not to laugh. The other students watched them with a mix of awe and exasperation. The Marauders, as they were now known in whispers, had become legend, but it wasn't all rebellion and giddy brilliance. There were moments of tension, moments when the cracks began to show hairline fractures that no one wanted to name. Sirius's family situation grew worse with every holiday. He returned from breaks more silent, more bruised by words he never spoke aloud. James was growing louder in his rivalry with Snape, which had begun as annoyance and was veering into hatred. Remus began missing more than just full moons, sometimes disappearing into himself for days, withdrawing behind a wall of unreadable calm. And Peter, always the smallest, always just a step behind, began to flinch when they moved too fast, afraid of being left out. But those were undercurrents, subtle things that didn't yet break the surface. On most days they were still united, still laughing, still planning. They passed notes in class that unraveled into miniature fireworks. They replaced an entire shelf of books in the library with decoys that screamed if opened. They invented their own spells, some useful, some absurd. They practiced dueling in empty corridors. They stayed up until dawn discussing the future as if it would wait for them forever. There was a kind of magic to it, not the kind that came from wands or incantations, but the kind that came from being young, brilliant, and convinced that nothing could touch you. They were gods of their own small universe, and the walls of Hogwarts were their Olympus. Outside the castle, the world was changing. There were whispers of darkness, of disappearances, of a name that people had stopped saying even in secret. But inside those walls, inside their private world of enchantments and firelight and friendship, they were still untouchable. There was a night, late in their 5th year, when the 4 of them sat on the Astronomy Tower, passing a bottle of something they weren't meant to have, watching the stars blur into streaks across the sky. James was talking about becoming head boy someday. Sirius laughed so hard he nearly dropped the bottle. Remus rolled his eyes, but his smile was real. Peter said nothing, just watched them all, the night air ruffling his hair, his eyes shining with something between joy and longing. That moment quiet, suspended between one breath and the next, was what they would remember long after it was gone, before the war, before the betrayals, before everything that would split them apart. They would remember being boys, invincible and ridiculous and free. The Marauders had arrived, not just in name, not just in reputation, but in truth. They had taken the worst of their fears, Remus's curse, Peter's insecurity, Sirius's pain, even James's arrogance, and turned them into something golden. They had made a world where they could run beneath the moon and laugh without fear. They had drawn a map that would outlive them. They had bound themselves to one another in ways they couldn't yet understand. And the castle, ancient and knowing, watched them in silence, because even it understood that these 4 boys, foolish and brilliant, had done something rare. They had made magic that didn't come from spells. They had made magic from friendship. By 6th year, the Marauders moved through Hogwarts like they owned it. It wasn't arrogance. Not entirely, though there was plenty of that, especially from James and Sirius. It was something else, something quieter and harder to define. They had unlocked the castle's deepest layers, carved secret routes through its bones, and whispered laughter into corners no one else remembered existed. They walked with the confidence of those who had learned not only the rules, but how to bend them until they sang. To the rest of the school, they were a myth already in motion, a shared joke passed between first years in awe and seventh years, who envied the kind of friendship that burned bright enough to blind. The map had matured by now. What had started as a clever parchment had become something more, a living, breathing artifact of rebellion. It updated itself as they learned more, adapting to the castle's mood. New corridors revealed themselves under moonlight. A spiral staircase behind the arithmancy classroom only opened if you whistled a certain Celestina Warbeck song. There was a portrait of a mermaid in the dungeons who would tip you off to Filch's location in exchange for gossip. These were details no teacher could track, no prefect could patrol. The map knew everything, because the boys who made it had learned to see everything. They used it constantly, not just to pull off pranks, but to escape, to explore, to breathe. Hogwarts could be suffocating in its traditions and expectations, and the map was their quiet rebellion, a way to write themselves into the stonework of a place that was older than any memory. They had given themselves names Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, Prongs, and those names had become personas, not disguises exactly, but fuller versions of themselves. Prongs was daring, noble, reckless. Padfoot was bold, biting, loyal to the death. Moony was clever, calm, and full of quiet fire. Wormtail was the watchful one, small and underestimated, but always listening. Together, they became something no one else could touch. Their pranks became the stuff of whispered legend. They turned the suits of armor in the entrance hall into an a cappella choir that only sang songs from Celestina Warbeck's scandalous early albums. They bewitched the Slytherin common room's door to scream every time it was opened, though no one could ever prove how. On Halloween, hundreds of bats spelled rude messages across the great hall ceiling in sparkling orange script, and every time something chaotic happened, everyone looked at James and Sirius first, who inevitably offered identical innocent expressions that fooled no one. McGonagall was exasperated. Flitwick was reluctantly impressed. Dumbledore, when pressed, only said that Hogwarts had always had its tricksters, and that perhaps it needed them now more than ever. Slughorn tried to bring them into his club. Sirius refused. James came once and never returned. Peter was too nervous. Remus said he had homework. They had enemies, of course. You don't bend the castle to your will without upsetting those who live to enforce its structure, but no rivalry burned hotter than the one with Severus Snape. It had started as a small thing, a first-year scuffle over cauldrons or spilled ingredients, but by sixth year it had grown into something sharper, more dangerous. James and Snape clashed constantly, words, spells, glares that carried more venom than any curse. Snape's hatred of James was cold and deliberate. James's hatred of Snape was hot, impulsive, the kind that needed an audience. Sirius was no better. If anything, he was worse. There was history there. Family ties twisted into knots Sirius had long since tried to cut away. Snape knew how to wound with words, and Sirius knew how to laugh at pain, and between them there was always the threat of fire. Remus hated the feud, not because he liked Snape, he didn't, but because it pulled something ugly out of the group, something brittle. Peter, ever eager to side with the strongest voice, echoed James and Sirius, but his mimicry lacked bite. He laughed a little too loudly at their jokes, stared a little too long when Sirius threw barbed words. There were moments when even he seemed unsure whether he was laughing or flinching. And yet, for all the tension it created, the group never broke. Not yet, because at their center, beneath the chaos and charm, was something real, something honest. They spent nights together in the dormitory, sprawled across beds with textbooks half opened and plans unfolding between mouthfuls of stolen sweets. James would practice Quidditch tricks with miniature enchanted players, narrating them with absurd flair. Sirius would balance ink pots on his wand while ranting about whatever new letter his mother had sent him, always ending up in laughter, always pretending it didn't sting. Remus read aloud from whatever book had caught his interest, half listening to their interruptions, smiling at their absurd commentary. Peter fetched things, remembered the passwords, made himself useful in the quiet ways that often went unnoticed. They were happy, in their way, or at least they believed they were. The map was working. The transformations were easy now. Full moons had become routine planned, safe, even comforting. They spent those nights together, wild and free under stars, Remus's wolfish form now steady among them. No one was afraid anymore. They had conquered that fear long ago, and in their wake, they left chaos wrapped in laughter. Students admired them. Teachers warned against them. Slytherins loathed them. Girls followed James with bright eyes and hopeful smiles. He liked the attention, even as he began to shift it toward someone who never returned it. Lily Evans, who called him arrogant, who rolled her eyes at his bravado, who made him rethink things in ways that surprised even himself. Sirius teased him mercilessly about it, but he watched closely, watched how James softened when Lily walked into a room, watched how he faltered, watched how badly he wanted to be better. Not everyone understood Sirius. His sharpness was a blade he kept honed. He could turn any compliment into a taunt, any conversation into a battle. But with James, he softened, not in words, but in presence. They argued constantly, but always as equals, never as rivals. James was the only one Sirius allowed to challenge him without resentment, and in turn, Sirius was the only one James ever followed without question. Remus was the bridge between them, the one who kept things balanced. His quiet authority had grown stronger over time. He didn't speak often, but when he did, they listened. He noticed everything when Sirius was about to snap, when James needed reining in, when Peter was feeling invisible. He carried the group's conscience, not as a burden, but as something he had chosen to protect. Peter was harder to read. He adored them, that much was clear, but there was something tight behind his smiles, a nervousness that never quite left him. He was loyal, always there, always trying, but he was also aware, painfully so, of how large the others loomed. He tried to make himself indispensable, keeping their secrets, covering for their pranks, fetching things they didn't ask for. They never mocked him, not truly, but he felt the space between their brilliance and his shadow. He laughed with them. He belonged. But somewhere inside the question lingered. Would he still belong if he stopped being useful? The school year passed in a blur of spells and scribbled homework, prank planning, and nighttime adventures. The castle changed with the season's frosted windows in winter, warm wind echoing through high towers in spring. The Marauders adapted with it. They charmed the lake to reflect constellations. They built secret compartments into their trunks. They left cryptic messages for future students in hidden corners of the dungeons. They were building a legacy, even if they didn't call it that yet. One night, close to exams, they sat outside under a tree near the edge of the forbidden forest, watching the stars scatter like dust across the sky. James lay on his back, arms folded behind his head. Sirius sat cross-legged, twirling his wand. Remus leaned against the tree, eyes closed. Peter plucked grass and let it blow from his hand like feathers. "What do you think it'll be like after all this?" James asked, voice soft, almost lost in the breeze. "Louder," Sirius said. "Wilder, more dangerous, more freedom," said James. "More expectations," Remus added. Peter didn't answer. He only looked at them, memorizing their faces in the moonlight, the way Sirius's eyes burned like twin stars, the way James's smile tugged at the corners, even when he wasn't trying, the way Remus looked older than any of them when he was quiet, and how small Peter felt beside all of it. They didn't know then how quickly it would all change, how war would hollow out the spaces between their laughter, how names would be whispered not in awe but in grief, how the map would one day sit in a drawer, forgotten for years, until another boy with too much courage and too many scars unfolded it again. For now, they were just boys under the stars, maps in their hands, mischief in their hearts, and the kind of love that only the young can carry reckless, fierce, and unspoken. It happened slowly, as most endings do, not with shouts or slammed doors or betrayals inked in fire, but in the quiet pull of gravity as things once tightly bound began to drift. At first no one noticed. The Marauders were still the Marauders, still 4 boys in Gryffindor Tower who laughed loud, walked proudly, and carved mischief into the walls of a school that couldn't quite contain them. They still stayed up too late, still charmed the map with new enchantments, still transformed with practiced ease beneath the full moon. But something had shifted. The bond they had built in years of secrecy and shared rebellion was beginning to fray, not violently, but with the soft, inevitable unraveling that follows growing up. Sirius changed first, or perhaps he only stopped hiding what he had always carried. The letters from home had long since turned to silence, and the silences had hardened into severance. His name was burned from the Black family tapestry over the summer. Between 5th and 6th year he never said how he knew, only that he did, and when he returned to Hogwarts, he did so with a new edge. It wasn't just rebellion anymore, it was rage. He drank it like fire whiskey, let it fill the hollow spaces his family had left behind. He became sharper, louder, more volatile. His jokes cut deeper, his duels hit harder, and though he still laughed, there was something brittle beneath it, a sense that if anyone pressed too hard, he would break. He never said it aloud, but James knew, Remus knew, even Peter, in his own way, knew. Sirius had run out of bridges to burn, so he started setting himself alight instead. James, meanwhile, was changing in a different way. The swagger was still there, the easy smile, the windswept hair, the endless confidence, but something underneath it was beginning to shift. He had grown taller, steadier, more focused. His grades improved. He argued more in class, but not just for show. He argued because he believed in things. He was beginning to step into the man he might become, and at the center of that transformation, always, was Lily Evans. It wasn't a crush anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. James was in love, and the depth of it surprised even him. She infuriated him. Still her sharp tongue, her high standards, her refusal to let him coast by on charm alone. But she also made him better. She challenged him. When she spoke, he listened, not to win her over, but because she had something to say. And slowly, painfully, she began to see him too, not the boy who hexed Slytherins in the corridors, but the boy who stayed up late, helping first years with homework, who volunteered for rounds, who led with loyalty and heart. She started talking to him like he was a person, not just a nuisance. And James, for the first time, started wondering who he was outside of the group. That, more than anything, shifted the balance. Remus saw it all. He always did. He had grown quieter over the years, more reserved, though not out of distance. It was something else, an understanding, perhaps, that things could not stay as they were. He watched Sirius spiral and tried to anchor him. He watched James change and did not interfere. He kept the map updated, kept the transformations on schedule, kept the group stitched together through the small, necessary things, reminders, nudges, quiet interventions. But he was slipping into his own world more often now. Books, prefect duties, long walks alone. He would vanish for hours at a time, and when he returned, he would smile like nothing had happened. But Sirius saw the tiredness in his eyes. James saw the distance. Peter didn't look closely enough to see anything at all, and Peter remained. Loyal, quiet, ever watchful. He still followed them, still laughed at the right moments, still fetched what was needed, and kept their secrets like treasures. But the space between them and him was widening, not because they pushed him away, not exactly, but because they kept moving forward, and Peter, try as he might, could not keep pace. He wasn't as clever, not in the way Remus was. He wasn't as powerful as James, or as fearless as Sirius. He was useful, yes, reliable, but he was beginning to feel like a footnote in someone else's story. And that feeling, that gnawing sense of inadequacy, grew roots. He started disappearing too, though no one noticed at first. Small absences, missed meals, excuses about extra tutoring, secret projects. He lingered near the edges of other groups, Slytherins, mostly listened to conversations he pretended not to understand. He began to hoard information, bits and pieces of things he overheard, not out of malice, not yet, but because it made him feel valuable, dangerous even, like he knew something the others didn't. And in the cracks of his loyalty, doubt began to bloom. The war outside the castle was growing louder. Newspapers were no longer filled with gossip and Quidditch scores. They spoke of disappearances, of attacks, of whispers behind closed doors. Students returned from holidays pale and shaken. Some didn't return at all. Professors grew tenser. Dumbledore's face, still kind, now wore the weight of things unsaid. There were recruitment efforts, secret meetings, strange visitors to the castle. The Death Eaters were no longer myth, they were real, and they were young, and they were choosing sides. Inside the common room, the Marauders still laughed, still played chess, still charmed the staircases, still planned one final grand prank for 7th year that would go down in Hogwarts history. But beneath the surface, the fault lines deepened. Sirius started lashing out more frequently. Detentions piled up. He vanished for an entire weekend once and refused to say where he had gone. James worried. Remus argued with him. Peter said nothing. When Sirius returned, he looked exhausted and had a new scar across his ribs. He laughed it off. No one pressed further. James became head boy in 7th year, to the surprise of nearly everyone, including himself. He took the role seriously, though not solemnly. He still pulled pranks, but he also led. He kept peace. He diffused fights. He walked the halls at night and memorized who was breaking curfew and who was quietly crying in stairwells. He helped them all, even if they didn't thank him. And Lily, she saw it. She started sitting beside him during rounds, then during meals, Then, during study sessions, they were not dating, not yet, but the air between them had shifted. It was no longer a chase. It was a slow, blooming trust. Sirius hated it at first. He missed the chaos, the late-night rule-breaking, the feeling of invincibility. He felt James slipping into another world, one with Lily, with purpose, with a future Sirius didn't know how to imagine for himself, but he never said it aloud. Instead, he mocked the new prefect robes. He scoffed at James's careful patrols. He rolled his eyes at Lily's name, but deep down, he was scared not of losing James, but of being left behind. Remus understood. He tried to bridge the widening gaps. He mediated arguments, kept the group anchored, even as he faced his own demons. His transformations were harder now, his body slower to heal. The Wolfsbane potion didn't exist yet, and each month left him weaker. He stopped showing his scars. He smiled through the pain. He told no one, and Peter watched it all. He saw James falling in love, Sirius spinning out, Remus retreating, and he saw himself, still in their shadow, still trailing behind, still afraid that one day they would leave him behind entirely. And the war, the dark promise of it, offered something else, something he didn't yet understand, but could feel in his bones: power, safety, a place he could be important. There was a day, late in 7th year, when the 4 of them sat together beneath the tree by the lake, the same place where they had spent so many nights. It was spring, and the world smelled like new things. James had his arms slung around his knees, watching Lily across the lawn. Sirius was throwing pebbles into the water, each one skipping further than the last. Remus had his back against the trunk, book open but unread. Peter sat apart, just a little, pretending to tie his shoe. "Next year," James said, "it's all going to be different." Sirius snorted. "You'll be off being noble with Lily. Remus will be teaching. Peter and I will be old men living off your fame." "I'm serious," James said. "There's a war coming. We can't just sit around forever." "Then we won't," Remus said. "We'll fight. Together." Peter didn't speak. His fingers curled into the grass. He wanted to believe them. He wanted it to last. But part of him already knew they would go on ahead, and he would do whatever it took not to be left behind. And so the golden years drew to a close. They didn't know it then, but these were their final months as 4, their final full moons, their final unbroken days. They would leave the castle soon, stepping into a world already burning. They would become soldiers, spies, lovers, traitors, martyrs. But for now, they were still the Marauders, still boys with a map in their pocket, still names whispered in corridors, still tethered to one another by memory, by magic, by a friendship that had defied the odds, and was now learning that even legends can unravel, thread by shining thread. They left Hogwarts, not with celebration, but with something quieter, a kind of pause, as if the castle itself was holding its breath. For 7 years, the school had been the entire world. Every hallway was familiar, every painting had a story, every corner held a memory. But as they crossed the threshold for the final time, the walls behind them felt distant, and the world ahead, vast and unknowable. There was no train ride home that summer that didn't feel final. They had taken it so many times before, laughing, scheming, dozing against the glass. But this time, they weren't going back to childhood homes. They were heading into something else entirely. The war was no longer a whisper. It was everywhere now in headlines, in conversations half hushed over tea, in the names of classmates who didn't return. Voldemort had grown from myth to menace, his name still unspoken but his presence undeniable. Disappearances multiplied, attacks crept closer to home, the Ministry issued warnings. Dumbledore began recruiting in secret, and the Marauders, no longer boys, not really, were swept into the current of it. James joined the Order of the Phoenix the moment he was able. There was no hesitation in him. He had always been brave, but now his courage had shape. He wasn't chasing glory anymore. He was protecting something. Lily, his friends, the world they had grown up in. He trained constantly, learned new spells, refined old ones. He stopped showing off. He became sharp, focused, driven. The boy who once levitated Slytherins for sport was gone. In his place stood a man who studied every dark curse until he could break it with a flick of his wand. Lily joined too, not for James, but for the same reasons he did, because she could not stand by and do nothing. The two of them, once oil and water, found in each other a kind of mirror. Their love didn't burn fast and chaotic. It built slowly, steadily. They fit, not in a perfect way, but in a way that steadied them both. Their flat was small and bright, filled with books and music, and the warmth of two people who had chosen each other, not despite the war, but because of it. Sirius moved in with James that summer, unable, unwilling to go anywhere else. He had no family left. Not really. The Blacks had cast him out years before, and now he bore their hatred like armor. He laughed louder than ever, flirted recklessly, dueled with a fervor that bordered on madness. But in the quiet moments, when no one was watching, his eyes darkened. The war gave him purpose, yes, but it also gave him vengeance. Every Death Eater taken down was a piece of his past burned away. Every mission was a chance to prove he wasn't like them, that he never had been. He and James fought side by side in battle after battle, moving with the kind of seamless understanding forged only through years of trust. Sirius called it the Marauder instinct. James called it friendship. Together, they were nearly unstoppable. But the war took its toll. They saw death too early, too often. Friends went missing. Bodies turned up. Each order meeting ended with a silent count of who was still alive. Remus joined the order too, though not immediately. He hesitated, not because he was afraid, but because he wasn't sure he was wanted. His condition made things complicated. There were whispers, even among allies. Dumbledore vouched for him, of course. He always did. But still, Remus kept to the edges. He took the dangerous missions, the long-term infiltrations, the ones that meant weeks alone in villages where no one knew his name. He became a ghost for the order present, but unseen. And when he returned, exhausted and injured, he smiled and said he was fine. He lived in borrowed spaces, took work where he could, never quite settled. The others tried to pull him in. James always said there was room for one more at the flat, and Sirius, drunk more than once, called him brother with slurred sincerity, but Remus resisted. He didn't want to be a burden. He didn't want anyone to see the full moons. So he stayed at the edges, loved them all from a distance, and kept his pain locked tight behind quiet eyes. Peter joined the order last, not because he didn't want to help, he said all the right things, but because no one rushed to recruit him. He was still part of the group, still included in meetings and missions, but there was something different now. He noticed it more than anyone. How James asked Sirius to check the wards, not him. How Remus sent instructions, not requests. How even Lily, kind as she was, always seemed to speak to him like he needed reassurance. He hated that feeling, that uselessness. He hated being the fourth Marauder, the tag-along, the liability. And slowly, carefully, he began to think about what it would mean to be needed by someone else, someone who wouldn't overlook him, someone who promised safety, importance, even power. He never planned betrayal. Not at first, but when he was approached, when whispers became invitations, he didn't say no. The war twisted everything. What had once been certainty became shadow. Friendships held, but with tension. Fear crept in. The stakes were no longer detentions and lost house points. They were lives, secrets, death, and even among the Order, trust frayed. Dumbledore grew more secretive. He spoke in half-truths. He kept his cards close. There was talk of a spy, a traitor in their midst. Everyone had theories. Few said names aloud. But suspicion hung heavy in every room. Remus noticed the glances. Peter felt the silence. Sirius, volatile as ever, trusted only James. And James tried to hold them all together, not realizing how far apart they had already drifted. Still, there were moments, small flashes of the old magic, an evening in the flat when the four of them sat drinking butterbeer and laughing until they cried, a full moon when they transformed in a remote valley, and for a few precious hours there was only the wind and the stars and the joy of running. A wedding James and Lily's where they danced in their dress robes and toasted to a future that felt real, if only for a night. But always, the war returned. The Order suffered losses. Marlene McKinnon and her entire family, the Prewitts, Edgar Bones, Dorcas Meadows. Each time, they gathered to mourn, to plan, to fight again. Each time, the circle grew smaller, and then came the prophecy. None of them knew it at first, only Dumbledore. But the consequences rippled fast. Voldemort had heard part of it, a child born at the end of July, a boy who might destroy him. There were two possibilities, Neville Longbottom and Harry Potter. And Voldemort chose Harry. The news hit like thunder. James and Lily were targeted, marked, and just like that, everything changed. They went into hiding. The Fidelius charm was cast. A secret keeper was chosen. At first they asked Sirius. Of course they did. James trusted him more than anyone. But Sirius, clever, reckless Sirius, had seen what the war could do. He knew what it meant to be predictable. So he suggested someone else. Peter, the perfect bluff. No one would suspect Peter. Not timid, forgettable Peter. He would be safe. James agreed. Lily agreed. Even Dumbledore agreed. Sirius watched Peter with narrowed eyes and said nothing. Peter smiled and sealed his fate. As James and Lily disappeared into a cottage in Godric's Hollow, the Marauders scattered like leaves in the wind. Sirius hunted Death Eaters with desperation, determined to keep them all safe. Remus, still kept at a distance, buried himself in missions, unaware of the doubts surrounding his loyalty. And Peter, smiling, walked two roads at once, friend and betrayer, brother and enemy. The war had taken much from them already, but it was about to take everything. They didn't know it. Not yet. Not completely. But somewhere deep inside, they all felt it, that the story of the Marauders, the real story, was drawing toward its final pages, and none of them were ready for how it would end. The days in hiding were not silent, but they were hushed. Inside the small cottage in Godric's Hollow, time became something slippery, marked not by calendars, but by the soft thump of Lily's footsteps in the hallway, by the rustle of Harry's breathing in the crib, by the crackle of the fire that never seemed warm enough. James paced more than he slept. His wand was always close. His laughter, when it came, was tight around the edges, the kind of laughter that hides the fear beneath it. Lily tried to keep their days light. She read aloud, baked bread, told Harry stories about stars and giants and the wind in the trees. But even she, with all her stubborn hope, couldn't keep the worry from her eyes. Every owl that didn't come, every sound outside the window that couldn't be explained, felt like a harbinger. The walls were too thin, the charm too invisible. They lived inside a bubble they couldn't see, trusting that one man held the key to everything. Peter Pettigrew. Sirius didn't sleep. Not really. Not after they vanished into the charm. He went after every Death Eater rumor he could find. He pushed too far, too hard, too fast. Moody warned him to slow down. Dumbledore tried to caution him. Even Remus wrote in a letter once saying, "You can't protect them by killing yourself trying." But Sirius didn't listen. He carried guilt like armor, because he'd suggested Peter, because he hadn't insisted, because if anything happened to James, it would be his fault. He was always reckless, but now it wasn't for fun. It was punishment. Peter kept his smile, kept it when the Death Eaters passed messages through cracks in the alley walls, kept it when he gave them dates, locations, names, kept it when they whispered promises of safety, of power, of survival. He told himself it was just information, that he was saving himself, that he wasn't the villain, just someone unlucky, just someone who didn't want to die. They would kill him, he told himself, if he didn't cooperate. They would kill his mother. He had no choice. He wasn't betraying them. He was just staying alive. But he knew. Deep down, he knew. That's why he shook when he was alone. Why he jumped at shadows. Why he couldn't meet Sirius's eyes at the last order meeting. Why he didn't visit James and Lily. Not even once after they went into hiding. He was their secret keeper. But he couldn't look them in the face. And he knew Sirius noticed. He could feel it, like a weight pressing against his spine. Remus was still away, sent by Dumbledore on missions that kept him at the edges. He rarely saw the others now. Letters were infrequent, meetings briefer. And though he didn't say it, he felt the cold shoulder. He knew something had shifted, though he couldn't name it. James was still kind, but distracted. Lily was warm, but distant. Sirius avoided him more often than not. And Peter was evasive, tense. The Marauders were still intact in name, but the soul of them had splintered. No full moons, no laughter, no maps. Just silence where friendship used to be. And Remus wondered, in the quiet moments, if they suspected him. He could see the logic. He was always away. No one really knew where he went or what he did. And he was a werewolf. The prejudice never fully faded, not even among friends. He had seen the way Sirius looked at him now, measured, uncertain. He had heard the rumors in the Order that someone was leaking information, that the Death Eaters always seemed one step ahead, that the spy was close. And though Dumbledore never doubted him, Remus doubted himself. Because what if it was him? What if, unknowingly, unwillingly, he had let something slip? He never voiced it. But it hung there, in the spaces between words, in the glances that lasted too long, in the absence of invitations. The night before Halloween, the sky broke into rain, cold and angry, the kind that slapped windows and turned streets to mirrors. Sirius was in a dingy safe house in East London, pacing the length of the living room, wand in hand, muttering spells to test the wards. He hadn't heard from James in days. Peter was nowhere to be found. Remus was on some assignment Dumbledore wouldn't discuss. Something felt wrong. He sat down, scrawled a note to Dumbledore. "Something is wrong. I'm going to check on James." He didn't send it. He stared at the parchment for a long time. Then he burned it, because the fear had become more than a feeling. It was a certainty. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, like a storm approaching, and it was coming for James. In Godric's Hollow, Lily stirred in the night. Harry was crying, not loudly, just a fussing, sleepy whimper. She rose, padded barefoot across the floor, and scooped him up. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, her dressing gown soft. She rocked him slowly, humming a lullaby her mother used to sing. James was still asleep, one arm flung over his face, snoring softly. She kissed Harry's forehead, pressed her cheek to his. "Shh," she whispered. "Everything's all right." But it wasn't. It never really had been. And outside, beyond the charm, Peter was running. He moved through the streets like a ghost, drenched to the bone, heart pounding. He had told them. He had said the words. He had given the location. He wanted to stop. He wanted to scream. He wanted to undo it. But it was too late. He apparated to a quiet corner of London, collapsed against a wall, and sobbed into his hands. And in the darkness, Voldemort smiled. That night was the end. The cottage was silent. No alarms, no crashing, no warning, just the sound of the front door unlocking. James didn't have time. He reached for his wand and barely turned before the curse hit him. He never stood a chance. Lily, upstairs, heard the thud. She knew. Somehow she knew. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She ran to the crib, placed herself between Harry and the door, and waited. She didn't beg. Not really. She offered herself, pleaded for her son, and Voldemort, bored with her words, raised his wand. But the curse didn't land the way it was meant to. There was a sound like cracking glass, like wind being torn apart, and Voldemort vanished. Harry lived. The war stopped, but nothing was over. The next morning, Sirius arrived too late. The house was smoking, the walls cracked, the front door hung open. James lay inside, still, Lily upstairs, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Harry cried, untouched, in the crib. Sirius didn't speak. He didn't move. He only held the child, rocked him once, and then left the house without looking back. Peter was gone, vanished. Sirius knew what that meant. By nightfall, they found him, in the street, cornered, eyes wild. "You betrayed them," Sirius said, his voice a whisper of rage. Peter didn't deny it. Instead, he shouted for help, drew a wand, cast a single curse, and when it landed, when the street exploded, Peter was gone. All that remained was a finger, and the wreckage of 12 innocent lives. Sirius was laughing when they found him, not the laugh of joy, but of something broken. He handed Harry to Hagrid without a word, and when the Ministry took him, he didn't fight. They threw him in Azkaban without trial, and the world believed he was the traitor. Remus sat in the corner of a flat that was no longer his, staring at a letter James had sent months ago and never replied to. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just folded the parchment and placed it in a drawer next to a map that had stopped moving and a photo of 4 boys grinning on a sunny day beside the lake. The Marauders were gone. Only ghosts remained. Azkaban did not welcome Sirius Black. It swallowed him. The cold was the first thing he noticed, not the chill of snow or winter wind, but the kind that settled inside his bones and stayed there, breathing against his spine. The sea beat against the rocks endlessly, a rhythm of doom that seemed to echo the pulse in his skull. The cell was narrow, slick with damp, and stank of rot and unwashed madness. The walls whispered, not with words, but with feelings: regret, horror, loss, despair. The Dementors didn't need to touch you to feed. They simply stood nearby and fed. Time in Azkaban was not marked by day and night. It was measured in how often Sirius forgot his name, how often he forgot James's voice, how often he dreamed of Harry crying in that blasted cottage and woke with blood on his tongue from biting it. There were no windows, no mirrors, only the sound of waves and screams from the other cells, and the knowledge that the world believed he was the traitor. They called him mad. He laughed often, yes, but not because he found anything funny. He laughed because it was either that or start screaming. He laughed to keep his mind from slipping into the cold completely. He whispered to himself, mumbled names: James, Lily, Harry, Remus, and even Peter, not in mourning, in fury. He knew Peter was alive. The rat had faked his own death and vanished, leaving behind blood and a finger. 12 muggles dead, 1 street blown apart, and Sirius framed, with the wand in his hand and the look of a murderer on his face. He hadn't defended himself. What was the point? No one would have believed him. Not when the guilt hung so heavy in his chest. Not when he had been the one to suggest Peter as the secret keeper. Not when Harry was left an orphan because of his mistake. The days turned to months, the months to years, and still Sirius remembered, not because he was strong or sane or immune to the Dementors, but because he had one advantage: he knew he was innocent. That thought, fragile and sharp as glass, kept him tethered. It didn't bring him comfort. It brought pain. But it was pain that reminded him he was real, that he had not betrayed James, that he still had a reason to live, however thin. In another part of the world, Remus Lupin existed, not lived. The war had ended. Voldemort was gone. Harry was alive. James and Lily were dead. Sirius was in prison for their betrayal. And Peter was mourned. A casualty, a hero. They gave him a plaque. They named him a martyr. Remus could not bear to look at it. He spent those first few months in silence. He didn't return to the Order. There was no need. The war was over, they said. He didn't go back to Hogwarts. Dumbledore offered him work once, some quiet research post in a forgotten wing of the Ministry, but Remus declined. What could he offer the world now? He was a werewolf, alone again, and more exhausted than he had words to express. Some days he walked, for hours, through forests, along roads, into towns where no one knew his name. He changed his appearance sometimes, let his beard grow, wore muggle coats. He avoided places they had once been together. No Hogsmeade, no Godric's Hollow, no London cafes where they'd once laughed over butterbeer and burnt toast. At night, he would sit in small rented rooms, his wand on the windowsill, and stare at the moon with hollow eyes. He still transformed every full moon, alone. No marauders, no shack, no padfoot to guard the door, no prongs to charge in playfully, no wormtail to watch and report. Just him, the wolf, in silence, in pain, in memory. What haunted Remus most was the guilt. He had suspected Sirius. That was the truth. He had wondered, once, during those last weeks, why Sirius had been so frantic, so angry, so elusive, why Peter had avoided them all, why the Marauders had stopped meeting, stopped joking, stopped being. He hadn't acted on the suspicions, but they had been there. And when the news came that Sirius had betrayed James and Lily, had murdered Peter and 12 muggles, Remus had believed it, not because he wanted to, because it fit, because it made sense, because it was easier than facing the idea that he might have stopped it and didn't. That guilt never left. He wrote to Dumbledore once, a single line, "Was there anything else I could have done?" Dumbledore replied the next day, "Only what you did. Survive." But surviving felt like failure. Peter, meanwhile, thrived, not publicly, not boldly, but in the way cowards often do in the shadows, in silence, feeding off others. He lived as a rat, literally, transfigured into a small, twitchy, gray rodent. He crept from alley to alley, slept in basements, curled in blankets beneath pub floors. He learned how to steal crumbs, how to listen in on conversations, how to survive without being seen. The world believed him dead. That suited him perfectly. He stayed near wizards when he could, disguised among their pets, hiding in corners, always listening, watching, waiting. He heard of Sirius's imprisonment and felt a flicker of triumph, then guilt, then fear. If Sirius escaped, if he ever escaped, he would come for him. Peter knew that as surely as he knew his own heartbeat. But as time passed and Sirius remained caged, Peter began to relax. He found his way to a wizarding family in the countryside. A kindly red-headed boy took him in, called him Scabbers, let him sleep in his pocket. It was perfect. No one suspected a thing. He was a pet, a joke, an afterthought, the perfect hiding place. And so he stayed and watched and waited. Harry Potter, the child who survived, was sent to live with muggles, an aunt and uncle who hated magic, who feared anything that wasn't normal, who told him his parents had died in a car crash. Harry grew up in a cupboard, unaware of the war that had shaped his very existence. He knew nothing of James's laugh or Lily's eyes, nothing of Sirius's fierce love, or Remus's gentleness, or Peter's betrayal. He knew only shadows and whispers, bruises and chores, the boy who lived alone in a house that never wanted him. And all the while the Marauders remained frozen in memory. James, the fallen hero. Prongs, the brave. Sirius, the traitor. Padfoot, the madman. Remus, the exile. Moony, the forgotten. Peter, the martyr. Wormtail, the honored dead. But the truth was not dead. It was only buried. Years passed. The war faded into story, into whispers told by candlelight. New generations of Hogwarts students filled the halls, unaware of the Marauders, their map, their secrets, their bond. The world moved on, but the truth does not stay buried forever. One night, in a cell by the sea, a rat scurried across the bars, and Sirius, gaunt and hollow-eyed, sat up sharply. He knew that rat. He had seen it before. And just like that, the fog began to clear. Hope, terrible and bright, ignited behind his ribs. There was still time. The story wasn't over yet. Not for him. Not for the Marauders. In the lingering haze of war and memory, the story of the Marauders did not end with a single betrayal or even the fall of Voldemort. It lived on in fragments in haunted eyes, in hidden photographs, in the crackle of spells remembered late at night. Time had unraveled the bond they once shared, but threads of it still clung to the world like smoke after a fire. Even in ruin, the echo of what they were remained. Sirius Black had died as he had lived, recklessly, defiantly, with his heart still tethered to a friendship long broken and a godson he loved beyond words. His years in Azkaban had etched shadows into his face, stolen much of his joy, and yet the glint in his eyes when speaking of James had never dulled. In Grimold Place, he was more ghost than man, imprisoned in a house full of hate and portraits that screamed reminders of a childhood he never escaped. And yet, he tried. For Harry, for Remus, he tried to be something more than memory. He told stories of the old days with a flicker of laughter, offered lessons in mischief and resilience. He wore the past like a coat fraying at the edges, but he wore it proudly, unable and perhaps unwilling to move beyond it. When the time came, he stepped through the veil, not knowing what lay on the other side, but certain he would no longer be alone. Remus Lupin lived longer, but no freer. He walked through the years with a quiet guilt that never fully faded. Of the four, he had always been the most introspective, the one who watched rather than leapt, who carried the weight of others' choices alongside his own. He fought in both wars, not for glory, but because it was right. He loved quietly first Tonks, then his son, but part of him never stopped grieving the boyhood he lost, the friends he buried. At night he still dreamed of the forest beyond the shrieking shack, of the laughter that used to echo through the halls of Hogwarts, of Padfoot's bark, of Prong's antlers catching the moonlight. When he died at the Battle of Hogwarts, side by side with Tonks, it was not as a marauder, but as a husband, a father, a man who had finally, painfully, found something worth staying for, and left it to make the world safer for his child. Peter Pettigrew's life became a twisted parody of what it might have been. Once the quiet boy who followed James and Sirius with wide eyes and eager steps, he ended his days as a servant to darkness, his hands stained with betrayal. Yet his cowardice was not born of malice, but of fear. It was fear that drove him to Voldemort, fear that kept him there, and fear that finally choked him when his silver hand turned against him. In his last breath, there was no glory, no redemption, only the faintest flicker of the boy who once laughed in the Gryffindor common room, trying desperately to matter. Of all the Marauders, his was the legacy most corrupted, and yet even he had once been loved. Even he had once belonged. James Potter remained frozen in time, 21 years old forever. His story was told most often through the lens of others, through Dumbledore's praise, Sirius's reverence, Lily's memory, and Harry's longing. He was brave, foolish, loyal, proud. He was the boy who stood before a dark lord with no wand in hand, who gave his life without hesitation. In life, he had been the nucleus of the Marauders, the gravity that held them together. In death, he became myth, a symbol of resistance, of fatherhood, of sacrifice. And yet behind the legend was just a boy who loved his friends deeply, who grew from arrogance into compassion, who passed through 7 years of Hogwarts with laughter in his heart and his friends always at his side. The legacy of the Marauders did not lie in the pranks they pulled or the mischief they made. It lay in the choices they made when it mattered most. In a world that turned dark around them, each was given a moment to stand, to act, to love or betray, and each chose differently. That, perhaps, was what made them unforgettable, the fact that they were never simple heroes or villains, but boys who grew into men shaped by war, by grief, by love, and still they were remembered. The Marauders' map passed through other hands, their names whispered in dormitories where laughter returned, their stories told in late-night whispers by students who swore they could still feel mischief in the walls. The map bore their nicknames, faded slightly with time but indelible: Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs. Not just names, they were a code, a promise, a memory, a testament to what friendship once meant. In the halls of Hogwarts, where the light caught floating dust and portraits murmured, their presence lingered, not in ghosts, not in echoes, but in the quiet remembrance of those who knew what it meant to lose and still to love. Remus and Tonks's son, Teddy, would grow up not knowing the Marauders, but the world they helped save would shape his every breath. He would be told of them not just as warriors or rebels, but as boys who once believed that friendship could conquer anything. And for a little while, it had. The world moved on, as it always does. New generations came to Hogwarts. The castle repaired its wounds. The portraits turned to new students. And the story of the Marauders became one of many, woven into the school's long, enchanted history. But for those who paused, who listened closely in the silence between footsteps, sometimes it was possible to hear laughter, four voices tumbling through the years, running unseen through the corridors, still chasing the moonlight. In the end, they were not defined by how they died, but by how fiercely they had lived. And somewhere in the space between mischief and tragedy, between loyalty and loss, the Marauders endured not as perfect men, but as unforgettable friends. A stag, a dog, a rat, a wolf forever young, forever running, mischief managed,